On the panel, we've got Dr. Jeff Burke. He's a veterinarian with Equine Medical Associates, and he's the past president of the AAEP, and he works closely with New Vocations Racehorse Adoption. Speaking of which, we have Anna Ford. She's the Thoroughbred Program Director for New Vocations. We also have Dr. David Cutlow, Managing Director of Retraining of Racehorses. He's a veterinarian and former president of the British Veterinary Surgery Association. And we have Valerie Hyde, a veterinarian with a focus on racing and sales work. She and her husband own a small stud farm in Ireland, and she's also an equestrian that competes on a thoroughbred. And so I was hoping that we could start this panel off, Anna, with you. And if you could walk us through, we heard about what Canter's intake process is from Ashley. New Vocations, I know, is a little bit different. And so if you could walk us through your intake process with those horses, and what the evaluation process is, maybe less intake, more evaluation process, and what some of the most common injuries are that you see.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks for having me. So at New Vocations, just focusing on the evaluation side of things, and some of the conversations from the last session, I know a lot was around the transparency of information that we're getting and how helpful that would be to be able to have all the information on that horse's history prior to coming to the program. And I have to say that, New Vocations has been around since 1992, and even 10 years ago, 5 years ago, 6 years ago, we were not getting the information that we're getting now. So it is getting better. But I wanted to start off with a quick story of, we used to not really know anything about the horses before they came in, other than having a conversation with the trainer or owner. And one comes to mind from Ohio that we had, and the horse was 10 years old, and the trainer told us he lost his eye 2 years ago, so he has one eye, and he's raced with that, no problems, but if you can take him, can you take his seeing eye goat too? And so we stopped and talked to our team, and we're like, well, we're not a goat rescue, we're not a goat adoption program, but man, this poor 10-year-old horse, if he's got this goat, maybe we should take the goat too. So we agreed to take the goat as well. And so the whole team was excited to see, this horse and goat combo when it came to the farm. And we were, kind of very sympathetic for the older racehorse that was a war horse and lost his eye and needed this goat. And we're really kind of worried about how we're going to adopt that out. And so when they opened up the trailer, the 10-year-old gelding comes off, and he's this big, beautiful, black, gorgeous war horse that we're like, oh my gosh, no problem finding this horse a home whatsoever, even with one eye. And then came off the crippled goat, waddling off with a broken knee, whatever was going on, and we were like, what did we just do? So we've come a long way from that, and we did find both the horse and the goat went to the same home. It was great. But the evaluation process for us starts before we even get the horses. And although I agree, it is hard to get all the information on the horses, and we definitely don't get it, we have found that the more conversations and the more questions that you ask before the horse comes into the program, you start getting more information. And it's not always that the trainers or owners are purposely not giving information to you. It's more that they didn't realize that information would be helpful. So, for instance, if there was an injury or that happened a year prior and it required surgery, the horse came back to race, no problem, they're probably not going to mention that injury because it's racing and it wasn't causing any issues then. They're going to tell you more about what the issue is now. So just keeping that in mind. But we have seen with HISA, New Vocations has a HISA portal, and when we are able to get the horses transferred from their owners to our HISA portal, we are getting some medical information on when horses have been injected, x-rayed, or any some of those issues. Now you have to decipher some of it, and there's some coding to it, but we then can look at that, look at the horse's racing experience or record and work record and see if there's any gaps, and then go back to the connections and say, hey, there's a gap here and a gap here. Was there anything going on at that time? It's amazing how then all this information starts coming. So it is it is a process, and every horse that we take in, we try to gather as much information as possible before they come in, but it does require a lot of work on our part. And now with everything being digital, meaning x-rays, ultrasounds, it's become a lot easier for if we're talking to a trainer and they say, yeah, the horse has fragments in his knee. And we're like, okay, do you have x-rays on that? And they're like, yes, we do. Can you get those? I mean, it sounds really simple, but just those little questions, all of a sudden now we're starting to get them. And our services at New Vocations are so needed right now that we can say, hey, if as soon as you get us these records, we can take your horse. It's amazing how quickly then those records will start coming. If you wait till the horse comes, then you're probably not going to get the records. Out of sight, out of mind. So those are just a couple of things that we try to do before they come in. And often if we have, so our most common injuries that we see are soft tissue, so tendons and suspensory issues or injuries, fragments in joints, whether it's fetlocks or knees. Sesamoid fractures have been one that I know Dr. Burke has worked on a lot for us. And then you'll have, let's see, am I missing one? Oh, condylar fractures. We get a lot of condylar fractures that have been repaired. And so those are the most common injuries that we're seeing. And we've also found that, you know, the number one reason why horses are coming to our care is due to an injury. So, so once we get all of that information, often if we're not sure what that horse is going to need, then we'll send information onto one of our vets. And we work with a team of vets. Dr. Burke's one of them. And then we have 2 other vets here in Lexington that we work with. And we might send the records to them just to review, to say, hey, is this horse going to be suitable for our program? Because our program is an adoption program. We're not a retirement program, so every horse is going to need to go on to a home. And so we'll have all that information as much as possible before the horse comes into the program, and then we'll have an idea of this horse is going to need to go to surgery. So if a horse needs surgery, it'll go directly to clinic, have the surgery, and then come to us, and then we'll have a rehab plan for that horse to rehab from the surgery. If the horse has a soft tissue, doesn't need surgery, but it's going to need stall rest, hand walk, turnout, then we'll send it to our rehab side of the farm to do that. If it's a horse that just needs let down time, it might go to our rehab side, or it might end up going to our training side where we have ample turnout and it can just decompress. So that's what we do before they come in. Now when they arrive, there's another evaluation that starts, because often, you know, we'll get all that information, then the horse arrives and you're like, I see there's a knee issue, but there's also this issue and that issue too, and then you have to have another evaluation start. So we're really blessed that our team, everyone on our team is really knowledgeable horsemen, and we do our own self-evaluations on the horses. And then once we've done that, if there's something that we feel a vet needs to come in and address, or x-ray or ultrasound, then we'll have that done. And normally while the horses are in our program, at some point they're all going to be seen by our vet. But we try to utilize our resources on the ones that need it right away, and then some are going to need some time, and there might not be much of a soundness issue at that point, but once it arises, then we come back and, you know, have the vets come and assess that. So once the horse comes into the program, we'll go back to that history and make a plan on, what is this horse going to need? Is it still the same thing that we thought before it came in, or has it adjusted? And then we make those adjustments. And most of the horses that we're taking in need some type of rehab, whether it's 30 days or a year, and we'll give that to them, whatever they need. And we typically are looking at the horses, especially the longer term rehabs, we'll bring them in and do another evaluation, whether it's with our vet or just with our team every 30 days, just to see if there's progress one way or another. Like maybe the horse is getting better, or maybe he's not getting better. And then we'll go back to the drawing board to figure out what we need to do. And so the evaluation then, once the horse we feel like is both mentally and then physically sound, that's when we'll start doing more of the working on the ground and the under saddle transitional training. But we won't start that process until they're both of those things, both mentally and physically sound, because we found horses that, you know, maybe they're physically sound, but mentally they're not socializing well, or they're not eating well. there's no sense in starting them in any training because they're not going to be at their best. And then the evaluation continues when you start riding them. You know, sometimes we think that injury is fine. The vet said he's good, go press on. You start working with the horse, you're a couple weeks in, and all of a sudden they're not sound. So then you go back to the drawing board. What do we have to do now? Is it the same issue that we've been dealing with, or is it something that's secondary? Because a lot of times we'll heal one area because, say, we had a chondral fracture on the left front, but really there was a right hind issue that caused that you don't even know about until you get further into the training process. So that's kind of a big overview of what we do, and I can get in a little bit more detail, but I think that probably gets us started.
That's
right?
perfect.
Okay.
That's awesome. Thank you. And David, being with retraining of racehorses, I was wondering if you could give me an overview of that organization, but also an overview of the current landscape of aftercare in your area and really throughout Europe. And I'd love to have Valerie weigh in on the same thing from her perspective.
I certainly don't pretend to know what's going on in Europe and how it works here. I'm learning a great deal every day, as I'm sure we all are. I'll make some observations about the GB landscape. It's changing. It's changed from where it was 5 years ago, and I have no doubt it'll be different 5 years again from now. And it's changing for the better. I'm seeing a lot more awareness. I think owners, trainers, their recognition, their anxiety actually, when they're looking to rehome a horse after it retires, I see that recognition and responsibility increasing. We know that some organisations, I guess Godolphin and others, have their own retraining setups. They do it very, very well. I do know that quite a number of syndicates now build into their budgets a provision for retraining. But I also see that some don't do it very well at all. And it is hugely important that racing, or we can do a great deal more about how we help with that first transition from racing into their second careers. I think historically, GB, probably the same as many other jurisdictions, it has evolved. We've got a very diverse, a very disjointed, a very passionate sector, all doing slightly different things, some doing a brilliant job. And that's quite a challenge because I think what's evolved is those organisations are all competing and shouting out for funding and support. And I think what emerged, and probably the development and the advent of the Horse Welfare Board that British Racing sort of recruited 5 years ago, they started to spot, and some of the major funders started to spot, that this all feels rather ad hoc. How can we join all this up? So since I joined ROR, we've focused on, what can we do more of? What can we do less of? And we've been given a huge opportunity, but a very difficult space to navigate, which is to play more strategic lead and coordinator of a rather disjointed aftercare sector. So a year and a half ago, we launched a strategy. We looked at all the reports that have been written, and there are countless reports that have been written over the last 5 or 10 years. We put together a strategy. No surprise, it's got lots of pillars like everybody else's strategy, but they're focused on increasing demand, which ROR has done very well historically, raising awareness. We have that safety net, but focusing an awful lot more on prevention, that first step framework as horses step out of racing. What is the owner responsibility in that space? If we create a space that says, hand it over to charity when you've finished with your horse, they'll pay, actually that isn't sustainable. So how do we put responsibility back into ownership space? The education, by increasing demand inadvertently, there's such demand now that we're finding people that really aren't very competent and are novice riders are getting racehorses that need retraining. We've created a new problem. And so the education and the support and the insights, knowing where racehorses come from, to make sure that those horses transition into second careers. And I've talked about traceability last, but that's the glue that joins everything together. For me, all those interactions, whether they are people involved in education programs or in competitions all the different ways we engage with owners of former racehorses, all those data points feed into the traceability piece. Traceability is an outcome if we engage with everybody in lots of different spaces. I don't think you can do traceability as a separate entity. It's not a one-off thing. It's an ongoing and dynamic activity and from engagement with racehorse owners. So I've just put a few pointers in there about, I guess, the landscape that we're in, but we're certainly very privileged that we've launched our strategy 18 months ago, and a year ago, the British Horse Racing Authority adopted the ROR strategy for aftercare as the industry strategy for aftercare. And that's enabled conversations to happen with the industry about collective support and funding for it. And I'm very pleased to report that we're making progress. Lots more to do though.
Valerie, can you kind of give us a comparison from where you are in Ireland when it comes to the landscape of aftercare and these horses transitioning?
Traditionally in Ireland, we've always had a crossover between our equestrian world and our racing world. Many of our trainers, jockeys, owners have a background also in equestrian disciplines like show jumping, eventing. Many of their kids go through Pony Club, also go on to do equestrian activities and then revert back into racing. So, you know, whether it's been horses being retired to their original farms that they were bred on, there's a lot of that in some of the farms at home, or retired mares, and we have plenty of retired racehorses in various farms all over the country. We also have always had retrainers and rehomers approaching trainers directly and looking for a racehorse. And over the years, you know, a kind of a trust relationship has built up between some of those people and the trainers, so they know which yards have horses that are renowned for their rideability, because perhaps during their racing career they've had dressage trainers and equestrians into their yards to help with the flat work of these horses, to keep them supple, to keep them riding on both reins properly, where maybe our jockeys wouldn't be as experienced. And especially in the national hunt world, where our horses are in training for, you know, 10, 11 years sometimes to that age. And so they, there has always been horses being rehomed to do another job. Some of them have been retrainers with a business going, where they've taken the horses themselves, and they then do what people do, and they do a bit more with them, a bit more flat work, see what they're up to, assess them more, and then try and match them with a rider that's looking for a thoroughbred. It's changing big time now, because in the last 5 years we've had the advent of Troella. I think Caoimhe is going to speak about an organisation at home that now promotes and incentivises people to take racehorses and compete in all our equestrian events, and it also provides training clinics, which is a big incentive for the rehomers to go and meet other people who are riding their ex-racehorses and have fun and compete at whatever level. And they run a big Christmas show, which I'm sure for thoroughbreds to showcase what we're doing and what we can do. Also, because now the spotlight is more on what are we doing for these ex-racehorses, I think trainers in Ireland at home and owners are becoming more aware that they have a responsibility to see the lifetime of their racehorse through, and make a big effort when the horse is in training to prepare him for what might happen next. Hopefully, if that's rehoming and another career, or, you know, obviously, you know, have the discussion, you know, using the vet and using the history and everything as to whether euthanasia is an option as well. But I think things are improving at home, and there's much more awareness, and there's more appreciation of the talent that's in these thoroughbreds. You know, they're wonderful animals. They're very honest. somebody mentioned earlier about warm bloods exploding, and where did that come from? Whereas you nearly know with a thoroughbred, their personality shines through from the beginning. And yes, you have to let them down, and people have to work hard to get them into their head that they're not going to gallop around a track. But they are so trainable and easy, most of them, to get jumping and to get maybe doing a bit of dressage and just as a pleasure horse.
Thank you. That's great. Jeff, I'd like to kind of switch to you now, because I know you're focusing a lot in your professional career on sales. So you're at the beginning of the spectrum of what Anna's dealing with at New Vocations, but you help so much at New Vocations with veterinary assessments, but also coming up with policies and procedures that are going to not only benefit the horses you guys have, but hopefully the culture of aftercare. So can you talk through this program that you've recently been developing with the AAEP and New Vocations to evaluate and assess horses at the time of retirement, and just kind of give us some background about how that's come about?
Yeah, sure. Can we get that slide up? Let me give you a little bit of background here as to what this is and why it came into being. When I was chairing the AAEP Racing Committee a few years ago, we had several subgroups working on specific items, and one of them was a working group looking at aftercare. And we realized, and everybody's made kind of reference to it, things can kind of be all over the place. And in our world as veterinarians, when horses leave the racetrack, and even when they come into an aftercare facility, and we look at them and maybe even go so far as to make diagnosis or diagnoses, there's been so much different terminology used for the same things. And we began to understand that if we were trying to aid in horses being rehabilitated for second careers, and if we were able to accumulate data that would help us to do that, we needed uniform terminology. And so what this working group did was create a form, essentially, and it can be used by the veterinarian at the track when the horse is leaving the trainer. It can also be used at the intake facility when the veterinarian there is evaluating the horse. It can be both. But essentially, the reason for the checkbox system is the terminology then becomes uniform. So where you can see what's up there, it's very specific terminology. We've tried to put together over time, making sure that we didn't miss anything that would typically be included when we're looking at these horses. And so we're looking at several things there. Musculoskeletal injuries, soft tissue injuries, even things like, which at some point I just want to make a brief mention of, but we do see some horses that are mildly neurologic, and that's quite important to identify those horses. We also see a number of horses that we struggle with because they're not overtly lame, but they're just not good movers, and we find out after we've been dealing with them for 4 or 5 months that they actually had laminitis and that they've rotated in their front feet. So we try to, if we're questioning a horse's feet, we always try to take radiographs of the feet just to know starting out where we're at. But anyway, this form is designed to not only be a very easy way for the veterinarian at the facility to go through and check off the things that they're seeing when they're going over a horse, but the point of it also is to be able to house this data and accumulate it over a period of time, because not only will it help us to understand what injuries would be potentially limiting to what specific activities later on, but it may also, because the reference has been made more than once today about that one last race syndrome, it may help us to actually help the horses that are currently racing and saying, here's what we're seeing and here's what happens to these horses if you're not careful. So there may be another slide there. This actually, the form that I've got here is 3 pages. Do we have a second slide that you can put up there? At any rate, essentially what you're seeing up there is for when the horse is leaving the track, the same identical form is later down, later in the form, same information checkboxes for the vet at the incoming facility. And then we have things like body condition, abnormalities on the examination, et cetera. I mentioned the neurologic status. And then we talk about the different, let me just page to that, suitability. And so we've got basically 4 levels. That's not necessarily something that's been standardized around the world, but it gives you a pretty good idea of what level of suitability that the horse would have. And that's just an opinion to be helpful. It's, obviously, just like when horses are racing, when they go into a second career, it's not just about what injuries they've sustained, but it's also about their temperament, their actual athletic ability. And then, of course, Anna's job, which is the hard part, is matching that horse up with that unique set of attributes, matching that up with a person. And unfortunately, we've seen over the years that the level of horsemanship, a level of riding ability has kind of decreased over the years. So it's a difficult job, but the main take-home point for this form is if we could get it into wide usage, I think we could accumulate an awful lot of data that would be useful for many purposes. And I've had some preliminary discussions with the Jockey Club just about the feasibility of doing something like this, but I think it might really be helpful.
Yeah, that was actually going to be my follow-up question is, there's so much data that can be collected, and I'm sure you have such a long-term vision for not only how this can help new vocations and not only how it can help all of aftercare, but I could even see some of this circling back to helping the on-track world.
Exactly.
Valerie, I'd love to pivot to you next if you're willing, because you hold the unique distinction as being both a veterinarian that deals with race horses and sale horses, but you're an equestrian as well. And so I was wondering if you could talk through the importance of if you have a veterinarian that's assessing these horses for suitability off the track, how important is it that that veterinarian understands not only the requirements physically of that horse on the racetrack, but on the sport horse side as well, to accurately analyze a horse's physical suitability for disciplines or levels in a second career and accurately assess long-term risk?
I can really only speak for myself and because my background and experience, but I would always, as well as if someone asked me to do a pre-purchase exam on a racehorse coming off the track or out of a trainer's yard at home, really, I would do that, but I would also be mindful all the time of the temperament of the horse. And I specifically would be mindful of who I'm vetting the horse for, because there's different knowledge bases in those people. You have a fair idea who you're vetting for, where the horse will go, for example, what type of a yard it will go into, who's going to be minding it every day, if it's a teenager, if it's a more experienced amateur rider, or if it's a professional event or show jumper. They're all very different requirements. So I think you have to take into consideration all those things. So, some of the cosmetic things like curbs, splints, an old scar, wound, even a small little corneal damage to an eye is not going to affect a horse for a certain level of competition. So I think you have to be practical minded in it. But if somebody has great ambition to jump 120 tracks and stuff, well, then you're going to have a look at maybe, maybe we should take x-rays of the front joints here, or perhaps his hocks, because he's going to be a jumper. And I also would try, obviously the horse would be wind tested as well, and that's usually on the lunge, or it can be ridden. And when the horse has been ridden, you can kind of assess the the motion of the horse, whether it's a lovely loose mover that might be suitable for dressage, whether it's a choppy short stride mover. You know, that horse will never probably win a show class, so you can advise your client accordingly. And I also would like to be able to maybe lunge that horse, especially if it's a horse coming off the flat and hasn't jumped a hurdle or a national hunt fence. We have obviously a lot of national hunt horses at home as well, and they obviously have jumps. So when you're examining them, you know they're capable of jumping. But if you're examining a horse for somebody who's coming off the flat, they've probably never had to jump a fence. So on the lunge, I like to maybe have a pole on the ground, and you can see them make an effort. You know, you can see if they can arch their back, or if they're, you know, if they're clever about it. Because some horses, some thoroughbreds have an ability to jump well, and others are better off just being flat horses or pleasure horses. So I think you have to take into account who you are actually vetting the horse for. It was interesting. I think Ashley mentioned feet earlier. Feet are, I think, can be a very limiting factor in the thoroughbred. They tend to have flatter feet than our sport horses, and also the shoeing is very different to in our competition yards, and they tend to have long toes. This is at home, and they tend to have sheared heels. So there's often a lot of remedial farriery work needs to be done with those horses, and you will discuss that with somebody if you're looking at a horse for a purchaser as well. Ulcers was mentioned as well, and that's something that you will be mindful of, especially the horse moving to a new surroundings. That's and I would probe on the history as well on behalf of my client, and ask them to do some looking up the race history as well and look for the gaps. And if I have a friendly colleague, a vet who has been working in that yard or with that trainer, I would often have no problem in having a small conversation with them and say, look, this horse had an injury 2 years ago. What do you think? Using your own practical knowledge at the time and possibly x-rays and the history, make a judgment call on whether this horse will be suitable for the task that the client is asking you for.
Thank you. My next question, I'm going to direct it to David because you have such a history as a surgeon. But I'd love input from actually the three of you as well. In America, and I'm not sure if this is true in other countries, but as someone dealing with selling horses off the track on a regular basis, we've seen this huge gravitation toward over-vetting of horses, where people, they are buying a horse for $4,500, $7,500, not a ton of money, and they're x-raying necks, and they're x-raying backs, and they're x-raying every possible thing on that horse because they want pristine. And I don't know if it's a thoroughbred thing, because the injuries our thoroughbreds have sometimes are very visible on TV, or if it's an information access thing where there's a million armchair experts on social media and so many ways to just Google the heck out of every little thing. But can you kind of speak to that? Do you guys, do you see that happening as well, that trend? And what would be your advice either to aftercare organizations to navigate that scenario happening, or even to the buyers or adopters when it comes to that tendency to want to overvet and look for the perfect horse, regardless of if it's going to be a 2-6 hunter or a trail horse or anything like that?
It's a complex space in it, isn't it? One of the other factors in that equation is actually increasing litigation. So if a vet, says this horse is okay, and it turns out 6 months later it was a lameness and the vet didn't spot it, you go and see what happens to the legal case and the highest. So vets want to be thorough. So there are a lot of aspects around it. When I talk about value of horse, I think there's some interesting questions. Why is a horse only $200? We heard earlier today about the cost of keeping a horse. Actually, that's the most significant thing. And if something's $200, what's wrong with it? Because I might be buying something that's going to cost me far more than I ever thought at the outset. So one could argue that a low-cost horse, the more information you have about it, may save you some money later on. I think you're absolutely right. We could do a great deal more. So what is pragmatic? What's reasonable? What's the expectation of the vet? I think we're in a society where we buy horses, and if they're expensive, we get them vetted. But if they're less expensive, do I take the risk? You know, shall I buy a cheap car and expect it to do 30,000 miles a year for me for the next 10 years? Or actually, do I buy one that's been checked with a dealership and had a 40-point check, and that's going to cost me more? I'm going to pay for that. So there's all these different aspects that need to be taken into consideration, and people understanding the risks. So how do we address that? We're looking now, I've still not got it off the ground, but a veterinary standards committee. The world isn't short of opinions, or lots of opinions, but I think balance and a balanced view from an informed sort of veterinary standards committee. How do we get some advocacy out there to young veterinarians to say this is reasonable approach? These are the sort of conversations to have, and actually guidance for owners about the limitations and what to look out for. I think if we're going to add trust and integrity and transparency, then fewer horses would need vetting to find out what's wrong. Buyer beware. You take the horse, you know, unless if we were more open and say, you know, actually this horse has got a hock injury, and it's got, you know, and it's got a misshapen, you know, hind left foot, or whatever it is. The more trust that we can build, the less will be the need to offer those sort of those additional safeguards. So I think it's really important that we help with advocacy and help young veterinarians gain experience by providing them some tools. And I think it's really important, if we're going to be honest about it, to open up that, to build that trust, that we give guidelines to potential new owners of former racehorses. This is what to be aware of. This is where they've come from. These are typical injuries you might see. This is a pragmatic way forward. If you go for the gold standard option, it might cost you $10,000. You might find that conservative treatment has less chance of success, but there is still some chance of success. And I'm just reminded by one story in that space. I remember a very long time ago, a veterinary surgeon coming into a room. He worked for a pharmaceutical company, and he held up a box of antibiotic tubes for the treatment of mastitis in cattle. And he said, this product, he said, it's £50 a box. It's got a 92% cure rate for E. coli mastitis. He said, that's good, isn't it? And we all went, that's fabulous. Yeah, new product. Where do I buy it? He said, do you know what the self-cure rate is for E. coli mastitis in cattle? He said, it's 89%. Just makes you think about pragmatic care and gold standard care, what other options are there that might be okay to try first on a low-cost animal. And it's us being open about that, building trust.
Do you have something?
Well, I think as us veterinarians, I think we need to advocate for the lifetime of the racehorse while we see them in their daily lives in their racehorse career as well, and we need to be mindful of perhaps doing things that maybe is not going to make the horse any faster, but is going to perhaps make him run a bit more and maybe make him less sound eventually, because we're not able to fix everything, and perhaps that horse possibly should be considered retired a bit earlier than continuing. And I think we need to help owners and speak to trainers more often about that whole life of the horse. When we're faced with challenging cases in the yards, you know, and do we inject again for the third time, or do we say, guys, perhaps we don't need to go again here, you know? I think, you know, we have to have transparency ourselves, and, you know, we have to be open and honest with the owners of these horses as regards how much more we can do for them in certain situations. Yeah, that would be my thing anyway.
I can just add that we definitely are seeing more people wanting to do pre-purchase exams and being a little more critical on those. However, at New Vocations, you know, we keep a file that we keep them in Dropbox of all of the the x-rays, ultrasounds, any medical information that we have. And so anyone that's interested in any of our horses and they've been through our application process, we will first send them that file and tell them to talk to their vet about the horse's medical history. And we'll also talk to them about what the horse has been doing. And, you know, if they're not familiar with a certain injury, we'll use that as a opportunity to educate them on that type of injury and what we have seen those horses be able to go on and do and what they can't do. So we keep it very open and transparent because we want them to have all the information that we have. And we've found that, you know, for two things, if their vet isn't for the horse based off of the information we send them, then we don't want them to adopt that horse because they're going to get the horse and then the vet's just already not going to have a good taste in his mouth and think that the horse isn't going to work out. So it kind of rules that out. And then if they do a pre-purchase exam, they can kind of look at certain areas and not, you know, do everything that maybe they'd have to do. And so we found that that's been really beneficial and helpful. But it definitely is something that we're seeing, you know, an uptick on is more and more people wanting more information. I know just this last week we had someone adopt a horse for $2,500 and they spent $3,500 on the pre-purchase exam. So we're like, what? And we sent them the file of all the thousands of dollars that we had already spent on the horse too.
I'd like to differentiate between two exams here because typically the exam that somebody like me does at New Vocations is we're functioning kind of like a team. And usually the night before I go out, I get an email with all of the previous images, a complete history, as complete as you have, which is actually very good. And so if I go out and I'm jogging a horse, and many of them, even with their injury history at this point, may be sound, go over the horse carefully, and maybe it has a history of having had a damaged suspensory branch. We maybe have some previous ultrasound images. So my examination will consist of really focusing in on the things that we know on a horse that is, at that point, relatively sound, just to provide more documentation to monitor the progress. Maybe that thing is healed, maybe it's healing well. And so what the purpose of my exam is to give New Vocations an idea as to where we are in the process in terms of if there's healing that's necessary, to document it for the potential adopter down the line, and then to say, within your ability to make this kind of a determination, is this going to be a performance limiting thing going on into the future? I would differentiate that type of examination from what we're calling a pre-purchase exam. And I just want to, one of the resource materials that I provided, hopefully you have a QR code in your material here, but it was put together by the AAP Racing Committee. It's called Transitioning the Retired Racehorse, and it's guidelines. And near the very end, there's two sentences that I think kind of clarify this. We encourage prospective adopters to pursue a pre-purchase type of examination as part of their due diligence when transitioning a horse from the racetrack to a successful second career. The information provided by any and all examining and treating veterinarians will be a valuable component in the transparency afforded during a pre-purchase exam. That's completely separate from what we're doing at the facility. And as Anna said, you know, if somebody came in, and Valerie said this very clearly earlier on, you've got to know who your audience is and who potentially is adopting. And if there's a horse that's available that maybe is going to be a high-level eventer and a really good professional comes in, of course they're probably going to vet the horse and spend a lot of money doing so and maybe take a lot of images and go through a lot. In contrast to that, there's a lot of people that just want to adopt a trail horse. It would be very inappropriate to be spending all that money for them when they don't need it. But you need to know them. Your job is to be the matchmaker and match them up. But I think it really depends on who is going to be adopting the horse in terms of what depth of purchase examination, if any, goes on. But that is completely distinct from what we're doing at these facilities.
So this next question, I'd really love all of you to weigh in because I think you have the best insight of anyone to answer this, even though you wouldn't normally be the one asking this. But for someone at an aftercare organization or a private individual acquiring a horse directly from the track, if you could give them your advice as a veterinarian and someone very familiar with aftercare, what are some of the most important questions they should be asking to get the best overall picture of, is this horse a suitable candidate for what I want to do?
I'll start, if I may, just to stimulate.
I would love it.
Just so that everybody knows what we don't want.
Yeah, perfect.
I think it's really important that anybody, it starts with the person selling the horse. If racing's going to be a supplier, a major trusted supplier of sport horses to the leisure market, and arguably 10% of horses in the leisure market in the UK have come out of racing, thereabouts, give or take a percentage or two, but 10% of horses are coming out of racing into the leisure market. Does racing want to provide valued horses that are trusted? In which case, what can we do as an industry to be open, to increase transparency, to say, this is what's to be, I guess, the integrity, to improve our integrity. So that's the first step, but what should an owner do for themselves? I think we do know that some are very competent, some trainers do have good pathways, but we've got to be mindful that some horses at the moment, where a trainer doesn't have a network, they know somebody who says they're a retrainer, they pick them up every Thursday to retrain them, and by Saturday they retrain them and sold them for $2,000 each to some poor suspecting incompetent or less experienced rider, and that's where we're having the problems, and those horses are not doing well, and they've got injuries, and they're coming back into racing with that rescue narrative, and they're asking for funding, and racing's trying to do the best it can. When we've created these funding pots, we've created actually an expectation that racing will pay, when actually there's some owner responsibility for themselves. So we would want owners to say, take somebody who's knowledgeable with you to go and look at this horse. Ask every question you think is reasonable. A veterinary intervention, even though it's low cost, bear in mind this is going to cost you $10,000 a year. If you're picking up for $500, is it going to cost you $20,000 in the first year because you found it had some horrendous injury that you now want to manage? So do consider a conversation with your veterinarian that you trust, that understands you want it for hacking or you want it for 5-star eventing. It's a very different examination. So it is about people surrounding themselves with knowledge and information. And where we have the biggest difficulty is naive people turning up and saying, thank you, I'll have one of those, it's cheap, and I fancy retraining one. What they haven't realised is that it's never trotted in a 20-metre circle before, and it's never had a leg down its side, and we're asking to do things, don't know where it's ever come from. I would advise them as well to go in the UK on an ROR course and say, go to an insights day and go to a training yard and go and learn where a racehorse has come from, so you can understand why it does the things it does and what's involved in retraining before you decide to get one.
Perfect.
I agree with all of those questions too. And I'll add to that, it's been interesting at New Vocations because we'll have adopters that will adopt just talking, like watching videos, photos, talking to our trainers on how the horse is doing and walking them through the whole process, and they don't even come and see the horse. And you would think that, so we have a policy where if, at any point, if the horse is not suitable, we'll always take the horse back. So we have a really open return policy. We have found that people that don't come and see the horses in person are less likely to return their horses.
Oh, how interesting.
And so the more we dove into that was what we think, and of course it's hard to really find the data on this, other than we know who's come and who has come to see their horses and who hasn't, and the return rate. But I think what happens is I would tell adopters to really be honest with themselves on what they're really looking for first and write that all down. What are their must-haves? What are their needs? And what are their expectations and what are they truly going to do? Not do they want to do, but what are they really realistically? Because a lot of people say, oh, I'm going to be a 3-foot jumper. Are they really? No, they're going to be a 2-3 jumper. Get really honest with themselves on that. But what we found is, or what I think is happening, is when you're on the phone and you're talking to one of our trainers about the horse that you're interested in, you're having this good, intimate conversation where our trainer is guiding you through the process and they're trying to gather information on what's suitable for you and all that information. And I feel like people are making a better judgment call on what they really need when the horse is not really in front of them. Because if you think about it, and some of you guys are going to come out to the farm this afternoon, when you walk through a barn of 30 horses, all of a sudden that horse that you said these are all the things I need, but then you see the pretty one in the corner, you kind of, but you're like, and I can't tell you how many times we'll say, we know what these adopters are looking for. They're coming, we have their application, we've had a conversation with them, we have 3 horses picked out for them that we think would be a good match, that they start veering off of, well, I think I could deal with this issue. And we're like, but you said that you didn't want to deal with any type of this issue or this behavior or that, a horse that might be excitable under saddle at this stage. Oh no, but he's gray and he's pretty and I can handle it now. So they change their whole expectations when they're physically in the barn with the horses. And so that's what I think is happening there. And I think it's interesting. So I try to tell people, before they come, to be really realistic on what they're looking for. I don't tell people not to come look at the horses, but I do tell our trainers, if they want to look at the pretty one in the corner and it's not suitable, tell them it's not available. And just keep showing them the ones that are suitable and what is going to be the best match for them.
I think I would suggest that they bring somebody knowledgeable with them, and so a second set of eyes is always better. Maybe see the horse in his current environment, see him walk out, see him even in the string if he's obviously still sound, see how he behaves. Is his head up in the air? Is he very excitable? Is he quiet? You get a really good idea of his temperament in that situation. And if he's a hot horse in his current situation in a training setup, is he going to be any different when you take him home to your barn where you might have a pony as a companion? And so I think you can learn a lot just by observing and seeing the horse in his own environment at first, and then obviously depending on what you want after, what kind of level you're talking about, as Jeff mentioned earlier as well. Perhaps you should have a list yourself, and I think his idea of a form with tick box is a very good idea. Have your own form, have your own tick boxes, and ask all those questions, and try and gather as much information as you can, as well as watching the horse in his own environment before you commit and before you get the horse vetted. So you have a good think about it, and also that that these people that are taking on a next racehorse are aware that that's just the first step. They then have to, train the horse themselves, get used to riding themselves, the new environment. I think sometimes there can be a little bit of naivety. Oh, we'll buy him on Saturday and we'll have him at a show next weekend. That obviously isn't possible in the vast majority of situations. So it has to be pointed out that it's a long road, but a rewarding road with the right help and the right advice.
Got a couple more minutes for questions. So does anybody have any questions they want to ask our panelists? Yes.
Outdoor boys? Could they discuss the return policy on these adopted horses and how that might be handled differently?
Sure. Yeah, Anna, do you want to tackle your return policy?
Sure. So the way that New Vocations works with the return policy is our adoption contract, just this will explain a little bit more, is states that when you adopt a horse from New Vocations, if within the first 60 days that you feel this horse is not suitable for whatever reason, you can return it for a full credit for another horse. And then after a year, we do allow people, you have to then keep that horse for a year, because we feel like after the time that we've put into the horse, we want to make sure that they're going to continue to have further training. So all adopters have to at least keep their horse for a year. After that point, they can then resell the horse if they'd like to, and then they continue the bill of sale. If they use our bill of sale, it lets the people know that the horse came through our program. At any point, if a horse needs to come back to New Vocations, they basically reach out to our office, and then we can facilitate getting the horse back into the program. We've also set up what we call network facilities throughout the country, which are normally adopters of ours that have large boarding facilities that are interested in horses that maybe weren't suitable for one adopter but might be suitable for another. And so we can direct some of those horses to those facilities as well. We also can put them back on our website as graduates that are now available again for adoption. So while the majority do come back if they need to, because we can reevaluate them and get them adopted back out, if there's not space, then we can use those other sources to do that and make sure that they do get into the next place. Because I know the ASPCA did, I think it was ASPCA, Tom would maybe know this, that the average horse has 7 owners in their lifetime. So, I mean, they're going to pass hands, and we've definitely had horses that even 10, 15 years down the road, they've called us and we've had to take them back. And thankfully, we have Mareworth Farm as our partner, and if they're to the point where they need to just be retired, we've been able to retire them there. But we do make a commitment to them. There is a wait normally, because we can't always just, maybe there's a lot of horses that need to come back at once. We make a plan and figure out with each horse, how can we get them into does it need to come back to us? Does it need to go into another adopter that we know? But we'll network to get that horse into a new situation.
Did you have anything you wanted to add to that, David?
Different subject, but I wanted to bring up something.
I say go for it.
Unless a question.
Yeah, go for it.
Something was touched on this morning, and I felt as a veterinary panel, maybe we could say a few words, but it was about the issue of euthanasia. I think culturally in society, there's a desire to keep everything alive forever, and immortality is a sort of aim. And actually, as a veterinary surgeon, I don't think I'll be alone in saying this. I've probably done more for animal welfare, preventing unnecessary suffering by advocating and talking and giving permission to talk about euthanasia. And I believe there are horses out there that should not be being rehomed, whether that's for injury reasons or danger to, temperament-wise. But I put this very bluntly, I hope I don't offend anybody, but being dead is not a welfare problem. Being alive and suffering for the next 15 and 20 years is. If you're in chronic pain, if you're neglected, if you're not looked after properly, that is an issue. And actually, euthanasia, I think we need to be talking more openly about it. It's an uncomfortable subject for some. As a veterinary surgeon, I recognise I've seen all scales. I've seen people say, my horse has had a good retirement, put him to sleep, and there's been nothing wrong with it, physically. I've seen horses, and I think we've probably seen more of these, where they've waited too long, and actually they should have put the horse or the animal to sleep some weeks or months earlier. And everywhere between those two, there's a scale. And it's a conversation, and it's complicated, and there's guilt, and there's what could I do more, and will it get better, and what should I do? And it's a very complex area, but I think it's up to, those professions and professionals in the space, whether they're coaches or veterinarians, to openly have those conversations sooner rather than later. And there was a report commissioned by World Horse Welfare 2017, I think it was Their Lives in Our Hands. And one of the biggest welfare concerns highlighted for horses is delayed euthanasia. So I just wanted to put that out there, as I'm an advocate for talking about it positively.
I'm glad you brought that up.
Can I add to the euthanasia? Yeah.
Of course.
So just to give you a little idea at New Vocations, so we served 600 horses in 2024. We put 32 down. And two things I wanted to share with this is that, yes, we need to have the conversations. It needs to be out there. And it's it's not just the racing side, but it's also on our adopters in the equestrian world too. I had a case in Louisiana where we got the vet information on the horse. It was very clear that the horse needed to be euthanized. I mean, I'm not a vet. I could see it. I was just like, this is a euthanasia. I sent it to the vet, our vet. He said, yeah. The vets that were servicing the horse, they disagreed. So what we did was we said, okay, well, talk to the owner, use it as an educational, time, and said, hey, listen, our vets are saying this is not a good case. It was basically the sesamoid was exploded into the joint. It was really bad. There's no surgery that can fix this. He's going to be in chronic pain. And so the owner used it as a time to just talk him through everything. And of course, he had no idea. And so what we ended up doing was I said, why don't we ship the horse to our clinic? Our vet will look at him because obviously there's x-rays here, and a large part of the exam is actually seeing the horse physically, and he's not seeing him physically. So let's ship the horse to the clinic, and then we'll make a decision there. And the owner was very much open to that. We did that. The horse was still euthanized. But then I got to talk through that whole process with the owner. And anytime we have a horse that's in our program that we deem needs to be euthanized, I always call or email the owner first. Normally I put an email together because I feel like all the information, the vet information I can send to them, they can look at it, digest it, and then they can give me a call if they want, or they can shoot me an email with questions. And as much as I hate, those are some of the hardest emails that you ever write. I hate it, but every time I do it, I feel like, well, this is the opportunity to educate owners, trainers on, although it might not seem like it was a bad issue at the time, like for this horse to move forward and have quality of life, it's going to be an issue. And maybe, just maybe, they might stop a little bit sooner next time or have more questions for their trainer to look at. Because they often do have questions, because they'll say, wow, I had no idea this was this bad. My trainer, my vet said the horse would be fine. And I try to explain in those cases that in all reality, racetrack vets are not seeing these injuries 2, 3, 4 months, 3 years down the road, right? They're seeing them like right there then. So you really don't have a gauge on how that injury is going to be long term. So I try to explain it that way, where we do have that experience. We've given these injuries a year or two and they don't change, they only get worse. But I think it's important that we have those conversations, and as an aftercare organization, we need to have, organizations need to have more of those and be open. And I've found when we do that, the majority of the time the owners really appreciate that you take the time to explain it. And again, I hope it makes a difference, down the road.
Great. Thank you for bringing that up, David. With that, we've gone a little bit over, so we're going to close this panel, but these guys all shared their contact information. They have great slides and the QR codes, so please, if you have more questions, if you want to have further conversations about this stuff, please reach out to them. They are open books. Yes?
Just one real quick thing on euthanasia. There's actually, I believe all these IFAR conferences are videoed, correct?
They are, yeah.
So if you look back in 2022, I gave a piece on euthanasia for this conference. So it's available, and it basically references, as you had mentioned, the guidelines, AAP guidelines for euthanasia, and it's
Perfect. Very helpful. Thank you, guys.